Well, depending who you speak with, the climate change talks underway in Durban are either shaping up to be another massive flop or they're making great progress towards an international deal to cut emissions. The Climate Change Minister Greg Combet is in Durban for the talks and he joins me now live. Greg Combet, thank you for your time. Firstly, have we seen any concrete steps forward at this conference so far? Are you confident that progress is being made?
Oh yes, hi Ashley. Yes, I'm confident progress is being made, and you've got to bear in mind that there's more than 190 countries here and we're all sitting around endeavouring to negotiate, so it's a very complex process. But Australia came here with two key objectives. One is to see progress made towards the achievement of an international agreement involving all of the major emitters of greenhouse gases around the world, including countries like China and the United States, of course. And there is progress being made on that front. But secondly, our key objective is also to ensure that now we've got an emissions trading scheme, a carbon price in our own economy, that it's going to be able to link up with carbon markets internationally. And I have had some very fruitful discussions on that regard.
As you mentioned then, Australia is saying that it's only going to be part of a second Kyoto Protocol commitment period if it is an agreement that does cover all of those major emitters. Aren't we at the point where a deal that does exclude some of those emitters is better than having no deal at all?
No, well, look, there's a lot of actions taken in countries around the world. You don't want to lose sight of that, to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And last year when this conference was in Mexico, we got a result where 90 countries covering 80% of greenhouse gas emissions around the world made pledges to reduce those emissions. And so one of the important building blocks for an ultimate agreement that is legally binding on countries to reduce their emissions is to see how those pledges are being implemented. And of course Australia's doing its bit. We've introduced our carbon price that'll cut our pollution and drive investment in clean energy. Other countries are doing a lot. So a good deal of the time that I spend here too is talking to other countries about what they are doing. For example, I've spoken with my Chinese counterpart and a host of other counterparts in different countries about what they're doing, and a lot of action is happening.
Back on the Kyoto Agreement, though, it is expiring at the end of next year, so time is running out. Again, considering that that is currently the only international agreement to tackle climate change, wouldn't it be in Australia's interest to keep that alive?
Well, the thing about the Kyoto Agreement is that it attracts a lot of attention because it has been a very important initiative over the last decade and more to reduce greenhouse gases in the developed economies. The thing now is that an extension of the Kyoto Protocol would only cover about 15% of greenhouse gas emissions internationally, and that's because we've seen such a change in greenhouse gas emissions around the world in recent years, and we're now at a point where developing country emissions are greater than developed country emissions. And so to be really environmentally effective, we need a deal that covers all the major greenhouse gas emitters. And for example, Kyoto wouldn't cover the United States or China or India and many other large greenhouse gas emitters. So what Australia's looking to do is to put in place the foundations to ultimately reach a wider agreement, because that's what's needed to be more environmentally effective.
But is it being too stubborn to say that it's all or nothing in that situation? Isn't there merit in the argument that we hear come up at this sort of conference year after year, that in recent years it's the developed world responsible for the majority of those greenhouse gas emissions that created the problem in the first place, and some leniency should be given to those developed countries if it means coming up with a deal again as opposed to no deal?
Oh, certainly, and Australia has always been very cognisant of that. I mean, that is why Australia, the Rudd government in 2007, ultimately ratified the Kyoto Protocol. And you might remember John Howard refused to do so, and that's because we recognise we've got a responsibility to start cutting our emissions.
Widening the Kyoto Agreement unless there is going to be a wider agreement covering all of the major emitters. So you don't seem to be taking that position anymore today.
No, what we're trying to do here is to build the foundations for a wider agreement covering all the major emitters, and that's not a correct representation of our position that you just described. We've said that we would contribute and be part of an extension of the Kyoto Protocol, but only if we can engage the major emitters, only if they will also be in an agreement, because that is what needs to be done to be environmentally effective. But there are many good elements of the Kyoto Protocol that the government is committed to. We're going to meet our Kyoto Protocol targets, and of course with our carbon price in our domestic economy we will meet the commitments we've made to the international community. I've also announced here, of course, support for a number of other measures that are very important for developing countries, including support for getting going a green climate fund that will help countries like our neighbours in the Pacific Islands, do what they do need to do to adapt to climate change, to adapt to rising sea levels. So Australia is very active in all of these areas, and we have very good standing amongst the developing nations.
Some analysts there in Durban are arguing that a price crash in the EU carbon price is looking inevitable. Obviously, this would have come up in the discussions you're having with some of your counterparts there in Durban. How likely do you think that scenario is, and what would that mean for Australia's carbon price when we do move to an ETS?
Well, we've already seen the carbon markets internationally, particularly in Europe, severely affected by the debt crisis that is in Europe, and that's what's driving the price of the carbon market down in Europe and in other markets internationally. So, I mean, that's not surprising when you've got a major financial crisis such as we're seeing in Europe at the moment. It affects all other commodity markets, and Australia is not immune either in that regard. So we're watching all of that very closely. I'm talking to my European colleagues. I spent a good deal of time with them yesterday in discussions about how we can build the relationship between Australia's carbon pricing regime, which is an emissions trading scheme, how it can build its relationship with the European scheme, a number of the issues about price in the European market. Today I'll be meeting a representative from California too. An emissions trading scheme will be kicked off there next year, and Australia's obviously looking to see around the Pacific Rim nations other emissions trading schemes that we can build relationships. I've spent a lot of time with my New Zealand counterpart. They've had an emissions trading scheme and a carbon price for several years. And also, of course, I met Korean representatives yesterday who are extremely interested in what Australia's done and looking to apply some of the elements of our arrangements to their own circumstances so that they can get a carbon price going in 2015. And of course in China it's been announced that they'll start emissions trading in 2013. So there's carbon prices coming into a lot of economies, and those of us who have an interest in linking up our carbon markets are spending a good deal of time discussing these issues in Durban.
Still though, what's your best assessment of when a global deal will be reached on this? And in light of no global deal being reached in the near future, will the government need to redo its modelling for the carbon price, as the opposition keeps suggesting?
No, well, the suggestions from the opposition are just completely dishonest and wrong, and they must surely know it if they've read any of the material. So there is no need to do any modelling. All that the modelling said about our carbon price is that it was related to the fact that there would be markets in operation in 2016, and in fact there are markets in operation right now. Australian businesses under our carbon price arrangements will be able to access international markets that exist right now through something called the Clean Development Mechanism, for example, and I've just pointed to a host of other examples of emissions trading schemes that are already in existence and that will open up. And we'll be having discussion about developing relationships with those emissions trading schemes. So there's a lot of progress. The truth is there's a lot of progress on this front, internationally. And again, I come back to the point that 90 countries have pledged to reduce their emissions. That covers 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Those countries are going about in different ways implementing those pledges that they've made, and it's very important that that process continues to be supported.
Still though, Minister, I remember reporting on the Bali United Nations Climate Conference back in 2007, and we were hearing similar sorts of messages back then that progress is being made towards a global deal. I'll ask you again, what's your assessment as to when that's going to happen? What's your best guess as to how far off the world is?
Well, I think just to try and simplify it, we're going to make more progress here in Durban, but these are very complex negotiations. There are more than 190 countries, all with particular interests, but they're all here and they're all making their best efforts to make progress on this because they're all committed to getting an environmentally effective outcome to cut greenhouse gas emissions and tackle this very complex global problem of climate change. So, I'm not a soothsayer. I couldn't predict accurately when a new agreement, a wider agreement, is going to be reached, but we're certainly making progress towards it here. But in the meantime, that's not all that's happening. Countries all around the world are implementing arrangements like carbon price schemes in Australia to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and we don't want to lose sight of that. At one level, at the peak level, if you like, globally, these negotiations are taking place, but on the ground, in individual countries, many measures are being taken to cut their pollution and to implement pledges that they've already made. And so that bottom-up work is continuing apace as well, and it's a very important part of the equation.
Climate Change Minister Greg Combet, live in Durban. Appreciate your time. Thank you.